Welcome to the Reason Roundtable, your weekly podcast and video cast. Hi, Mom, from the magazine of Free Minds and Free Markets. I am Matt Welch, joined by Nick Gillespie, Peter Suderman, and special guest star Emma Camp. Happy Stupor Monday, everyone.
Hi there.
Hey, Matt.
Happy Monday.
That's right. Quickly, probably beginning with Emma, what was your favorite Super Bowl moment? Do you know what a Super Bowl is, Emma?
I actually, I did not, neither my husband or I realized that the Super Bowl was happening until last night at 9 p.m. And so halfway through us watching Dune, I pulled up my laptop and I checked the score. And the only reason why I wanted to know, I was delighted to see that the Chiefs won. And the reason why is that my current pet conspiracy theory is that if the Chiefs won, then Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce would get married, she'd have a baby, and because women, I guess, are stupid, it would cause a huge baby boom among millennial women who are inspired by Taylor Swift. It would reverse the birth rate decline. And America would be saved.
There are, in fact, many people who seem to believe
I
this.
think you were still watching Dune.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, we'll see if America gets saved, and now 1 million babies will get born because of Taylor Swift.
They're going to have the Kwisatz Haderach.
Yes.
Nick, I know that your favorite moment was the RFK ad. So what was your second favorite moment?
Absolutely. I liked seeing Lana Del Rey. But she was seated below the Taylor Swift level of startude, which I thought was wrong. But my favorite bit was the ad paid for by the guy who owns Hobby Lobby about Jesus washing feet and not hating people. It was great. And, the Super Bowl has a history of religious ads. And, of course, Scientology popped up somewhere in the second half.
Many times.
And there was also Marky Mark. Mark Wahlberg was pushing a Catholic app called Hallow. So, there was religion all over the place, except there was no Hamas video or ISIS video. I don't know. Maybe they got it in too late or that didn't meet the right technical standards. But I liked the G's Us ad, partly because I didn't know where it was going. I was very curious to see who it was by, and it was good.
Peter, what was your favorite cocktail that you made during the Super Bowl?
I actually didn't drink any cocktails last night. I didn't watch the Super Bowl or drink any cocktails. What I did do, however, was I read the New York Times' excellent little mini feature, sort of oral history of what is probably the most famous Super Bowl ad of all time, the 1984 Apple ad directed by Ridley Scott. This is the ad that really launched the Super Bowl advertisement realm into the stratosphere, where watching the ads became at least as a big a part as a big a thing as watching the game itself. And what was really interesting about that piece was that they had all of the principals who were still alive who were involved in making it, and they talked about this idea that they wanted to capture that computers, this was in the early 1980s, that personal computing would be an instrument of freedom, and that in particular against repressive governments. And at the end, a couple of them were like, well, now we see that it's just about spreading lies and misinformation, and these are tools to sort of confuse people. But it was really interesting to go back to the 1980s when personal computing was quite new and see that they all had this idea that personal computers and that the internet and that technology would in fact free us and help people, particularly against repressive governments.
I do want to point out when I read that piece, which is great, and I think everybody should do it, it was actually the guy who wrote the ad or conceived the ad, who was like, and of course now, computers have enslaved us. And it's like, what a fucking douchebag. Absolute full stop. It's like, if you think you are less free now, first off, dubious. But secondly, if you think that's because computers have enslaved us, it's like you've been watching The Matrix too long and cashing the royalty checks or whatever you got for doing that ad. But so wrong.
I just think it's all Mean Joe Green erasure, Nick, and I'm not going to.
Yeah, that's true.
For it.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk about news of the
Matt,
week.
you failed to say what your favorite.
Oh, right. I would say probably the surprise of watching the visually disgusting Post Malone do a really good version of America the Beautiful. I find him repulsive in just on every possible level, but he's a pretty interesting musician, and really liked the way he played the guitar. It was just, that was not an easy lift. There's a little surprise chord towards the end, and he sang it well. It was really nice. I loved it.
Why do you gotta body shame that guy?
What's up?
Why do you gotta body shame that guy?
I'm not body shaming.
It's
I'm
face tattooing shaming.
Yeah, he did choose.
I think this means Mike Tyson is going to be doing America the Beautiful next. It was also, by the way, a great moment was pulling out Reba McEntire, who I looked up as 68 years young, and did a god-awfully great version of the national anthem.
That's right. America
only
wins.
ruined by the blue whatevers flying overhead.
Ruins,
everybody hates
improved.
them. Everybody hates
do they,
them.
Nick?
Yeah, everybody in
right.
the military does. I can tell you that.
Got your
Check
ear,
it out.
Got your ear to the ground.
Yeah,
with our service people. All right, let's talk about the damn news, Nick Gillespie. Since last this podcast convened, President Joseph Robinette Biden II talked about having a recent conversation with French President Francois Mitterrand, who died in 1996. And then he talked about having a recent conversation with German President or Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who died in 2017. Then in the most politically damaging non-prosecution memo since the good old days of Hillary Clinton and James Comey, Special Prosecutor Robert Hur declared in a documents mishandling case that Biden would be hard to convict in a courtroom, so he's not going to bring the case because he's, quote, a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory that he, quote, did not remember when he was vice president, and that, quote, he did not remember even within several years when his son Beau died. And there's actually more to that. This last bit about Beau got Biden so pissed that he held an angry impromptu press conference at the White House where he shook his fist at clouds and confused Egypt with Mexico. In perhaps related news, a new ABC News Ipsos poll shows that 86% of Americans think Biden is too old to be president.
Is that a lot?
Nick,
it's good to see us pulling together on something.
Nick, my question is, what's wrong with the other 14%? And more seriously, how do you respond to the critique that you will see more and more of from mostly the media, that this is all much ado about nothing, especially when compared to the objectively awful daily excretions from Biden's chief competitor, Donald Trump?
Yeah. One, I want to say I'm looking forward to a second Biden term where he tears a page from the mob boss Vinny the Chin Gigante and starts wandering around Washington in a bathrobe in order to, scare people or avoid federal trials and things like that. It's obviously a completely legitimate issue. Biden has, is showing, who knows if he has it, but he's showing clear signs of cognitive decline, if that's even, if he has anything left to give on that count. So it's obviously an issue, and it should be. It doesn't mean, being old doesn't mean you can't run a country. Konrad Adenauer, who was 1,000 years old when he oversaw the German miracle, was fine. He was competent, and he actually did a lot of great things and helped, create a stable post-war Europe. I remember seeing on Turner Classic Movies years ago a newsreel about Konrad Adenauer when he was chancellor of West Germany and everything, and he was playing Boule, or whatever the Germans call it, bocce or Boule, Matt, and it was like Mr. Burns on The Simpsons. He could only drop the ball, and even then it didn't really land. But he's good. Trump also has issues, right? He has mental issues and impulse issues that need to be fully discussed. What do you think, when you run two ancient people who are too old for the jobs that they're going for? Yes, it's a totally legitimate issue. And the attempt to kind of ban that or to shame people from talking about it is just partisan hackery and anxiety over Trump actually winning a second term, which I don't think he's going to, but it's plausible. But that's all that this is. And it should be brushed aside like that. And we should be talking about what are Biden's policies? Why is he so unpopular? Biden is as unpopular a president as Trump was. And if you go to like Ballotpedia or any place that stacks up approval and disapproval ratings at the same time in their presidency, you see something there. The big difference is that under Trump, at least up until COVID, so the poll numbers will start reflecting that if you do side by side, but about 10 percentage points more of Americans thought the country was going in the right direction under Trump. If you can believe it, than Biden. Biden has real problems, and the mental stuff isn't going to help, and it can't be waved away.
Peter, you live in D.C. Surely you've heard someone talk about a backup plan. Somewhere, somebody has a backup plan than having a guy who talks to dead people.
Okay, so here is how it's going to work. Is first, Taylor Swift is going to win the Super Bowl. And then... And that's who has the backup plan. I want to be clear. It's they. That's the official name. They are going to install Michelle Obama onto the Democratic ticket. And that is the backup plan. And it's real. It's absolutely, if you just walk, I mean, when I'm walking my dog in my neighborhood, when I'm taking him to taking my little pup to the dog park and hearing people talk about Twitter at the dog park, which is a real thing that happens in my life. Like they are all like, oh yeah, that's the plan. They have it.
Are you kidding?
There's no backup plan. No, seriously, there's no backup plan here. There is no, and in part there's no backup plan because there's no real process for removing Biden from the ticket at this point, with the exception of Biden himself deciding to step down. Now, insiders, people who have influence, he has advisors. There are people who are at high levels in the Democratic Party. They could go to him and say, we think you should step down. At the same time, that is a vote of no confidence in the person who is currently the leader of the party. It's a just politically difficult thing to do. Biden himself has said repeatedly, this is not reporting from the inside of the White House. This is something that Biden has said and is very clear that he believes he is unique within the Democratic Party in his ability to beat Donald Trump. And so part of the issue here is that Biden believes he's special. He's the only one who can beat Donald Trump and the one who must. And so I think it's not impossible for me to imagine him stepping down. Anything could happen. But Biden believes that he has a unique duty to the country and to the party to stay in the race because he is the one who did beat Donald Trump and the one who therefore can beat Donald Trump and no one else can. And I think that is going to result in a Biden-Trump race, the horrible, terrible, no good Statler versus Waldorf, two old men race that we have been worrying would happen here for the last couple of years.
Emma, you're a youth, and one of the peculiar things about the polling in this election is that the youths who have been voting for Democrats by well in excess of 2/3 for a while now for president. The youths are kind of backing old Trumpy and are disassociating themselves, particularly with Biden's Israel policy. But beyond all that, since you are a youth, what's it like to see like these old men, the people who look like not your grandpa, but your great grandpa out there running the country and running for president?
Exhausting and a little disheartening, but also I think considering, I don't know, I'm 24, old men being the political front runners has been the status quo for like as long as I've had sort of interesting political thoughts, which is not that long.
You're calling Hillary Clinton a man?
That's what I heard.
I mean, okay, old people.
You're misgendering her.
Yeah, sorry about that. And I think, I was talking with some friends about this over the weekend, and it really increasingly seems like our options are senile but also wants to be dictator for life. And for me personally, I prefer just senile, but it would be nice if we had someone who was neither senile nor kind of wants to be president forever. But, the powers that be, the sort of political momentum, it really just feels like Biden is staying the Democratic nominee, not because anybody really wants him to be, but because we're just kind of headed down this hill and it's just kind of the inertia leading us here. And, you know, I don't know how a rematch is going to go, but I'm not very excited about it.
Do we think of Trump as senile? I guess I think of him more as deranged. He's a maniac.
Yeah, that's probably more accurate.
But he's losing it. Like, he has trouble recalling very basic facts and who's in charge and things like that.
To be clear, when I call someone deranged, I don't mean that they are particularly sharp mentally.
Yeah, either way, both with like serious cognitive issues, even if they take different forms.
Nick, there are 3 ex-presidents younger than Donald Trump.
Yeah. Don't ask me to name them.
No, I know you can't anymore, but
No.
And the 3 leading, semi-leading floated contenders for third-party and independent contenders this time around, RFK, Joe Manchin, should he choose to run on no labels.
You know, it's his for the taking, too.
And Dr. Jill Stein, they are all older than Reagan was when he won the election.
Yeah, that's...
Are you, at this point, ready for a constitutional amendment to ban boomers from the White House?
No, because nature is taking care of that, Matt.
Is it?
Eventually. No, I think... Well, and I guess Biden is actually he's too old to be a boomer. But
yes.
This is the end of the boomer era of presidents, I think.
You've been saying this for a while, Nick Gillespie.
No, because in 2016 and 2020, it was like most of the biggest candidates were boomers. But Bill Clinton, Joe Clinton, Jeff Clinton, Roger Clinton. George Clinton would have been a better picker. But, Bill Clinton was the first boomer president took office in 93, or, won in 92. This is the end of that era. And they've had a good, long, disastrous run. Each one has been worse than the next. I think I can say that. And this will be the end of that. But no, and of course, no constitutional amendments for anything. What have constitutional amendments ever solved other than giving us the Bill of Rights and ending slavery?
Repealing prohibition, sir.
And women
but
also
they
right
gave us prohibition, so that's kind of a wash, Matt.
Peter Suderman, speaking of presidents, the sitting president.
Speaking of cognitive decline,
a guy, the jacket. He declined for a second year running to be given a softball interview at the Super Bowl, which is the most watched event on television.
Wait, wouldn't it be a pigskin interview?
What's that?
Softball is a different sport, Matt. Even
Thanks.
I know this.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I liked
instead of doing that, the president released a tweet and a video in which he said, quote, "While you were Super Bowl shopping, did you notice smaller than usual products where the price stays the same?
Jesus
Folks
Christ.
are calling it shrinkflation, and it means companies are giving you less for every dollar you spend. I'm calling on the big consumer brands to put a stop to it." So is Dorito shaming the key to his second term?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Micro initiatives. It worked for Bill Clinton, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So over the weekend, I made chicken wings with a new recipe for making new to me recipe for making chicken wings in the oven. I was using a version of the Kenji Lopez baking powder system to get them extra crispy. And I accompanied those chicken wings with some of my favorite heat up in the oven biscuits from a company that I've been purchasing heat up in the oven biscuits for a long time. And I noticed that something was different about them. They were advertising on the front, now only 100 calories. And they used to have been like 250 calories per biscuit. And the reason they're only 100 calories is because they're like half the size, like less than half the size. They're like these little tiny like mini biscuits now. And you know what? I'm glad Joe Biden is trying to fix that for me.
It would be nice if he tried to fix it by, right-sizing his fiscal policy. Or jawboning the Fed rather than, freaking snack food makers. Frito-Lay never did anything wrong to America, Matt Welch.
It's just insane that Joe Biden in particular is out there with a message of, wait, isn't inflation bad?
Yeah. Things are getting smaller. Come on, man.
Given that Joe Biden started his tenure as president with a $2 trillion unpaid for stimulus plan that just about every analyst said wasn't the sole factor for the massive rise in inflation over the next couple of years, but significantly contributed to it. He was warned at the time that it would cause inflation. It then caused inflation. And he was like, no, that it couldn't possibly have $2 trillion. And then he followed it up with a bunch more with a bunch more spending after that. And Joe Biden is at least partially responsible for the fact that my biscuits have become tiny and that there aren't enough Doritos in the bag, and he's the one complaining about it. It's ridiculous.
Did your biscuits bring all the boys to the yard, Suderman?
I'm not going to answer that. That's a personal question.
I
don't even have a yard. I live in a city.
Another way that Biden has contributed to or tried to contribute to inflation, whether he announced that intentionally or not, is with a variety of student loan forgiveness schemes, some of which have happened, some of which have not. Emma, you've covered this a lot. Can you give us the sort of status of where student loan policy is, both as policy and as a campaign issue? Are we going to see new big promises coming down the pike?
Yeah, it looks like for the time being, attempts to do this sort of massive blanket student loan forgiveness has been tabled because it doesn't seem like the Supreme Court is going to let it happen. However, that does not mean that the Biden administration will not find a way to spend billions and billions of dollars forgiving student loans because one of the rule changes that they made when they originally announced the blanket student loan forgiveness in 2022, I want to say, was changes to the income-driven repayment program. This is kind of complicated, wonky stuff, but basically there are programs that you can have basically your student loan payment pegged to a certain percentage of your discretionary income. And the Biden administration changed that, the most popular plan, to be absurdly generous. So it used to be that if you were in this plan, you would have your payments would be 10% of your discretionary income defined as 150% of the federal poverty rate, and you would pay that for 20 years. Now it is 10 years of paying 5% of your discretionary income defined as 225% of the federal poverty rate. And so basically what this means is that people enrolled in this plan are going to end up paying back freakishly small amounts of what they actually borrowed. And what this means is that with this new IDR, federal student loans are basically grants, which, is going to end up making the problem of colleges costing too much, particularly graduate schools, people borrowing too much, particularly for graduate school. If you want to hear this in even more detail, I have a feature about it in the newest issue of wonderful glossy Reason magazine. But basically, it's going to incentivize colleges to keep hiking their prices and cause what student loan crisis we have to continue to exist and get even worse. So this thing that's supposed to solve, quote unquote, solve the student loan crisis is in fact going to make it much worse. Unsurprisingly.
And one of the sort of interesting unintended consequences of this, Emma, you wrote about, is that it's not just that it's going to make higher education more expensive, period, and contribute to the student loan crisis. It's that it's particularly going to incentivize students to go into low-quality, very expensive degree programs, right? And so in the way that these subsidies often sort of end up, they make things cheaper, right? Like that's what they do. And so what they end up doing is saying is giving people incentives to go into very expensive programs that do not necessarily pay off, where you are spending $90,000 or $100,000 on a degree and then coming out and getting a job where you're not making very much money. But that can work in this that can work in this environment because the way the income-driven repayment program changes work is that you pay back a lot less. And so it just means, well, okay, that degree suddenly it's removing price signals from the system in a way that's going to make things worse, I think, for some individual students, but also going to probably reduce the quality of at least some number of degrees over time.
I would like to see a Truth and Reconciliation Commission with student loans, so that if you get forgiven, you have to sit down across the table from taxpayers who didn't go to college, who paid for you to go to college, and kind of just work things out. What's great about Emma's piece, which I recommend everybody read, is that it focuses on graduate school. Back when I was going to graduate school, you didn't basically you didn't go to grad school unless grad school was paying for you. And then there were, and that's actually a pretty good, kind of metric, especially if you're talking about trying to get into academia and things like that. But the vast multiplication of kind of MA programs, in particular terminal MAs, that people think they need in order to get a good job now, because you hear this all the time that, graduating college is like what graduating high school used to be. It's just not true. And we already have so many people clogging bullshit MA programs for certification and things that they don't actually need. It's huge. And that's such a big factor in the top line number of student loan debt when you hear it. And it also throws in people who go to law school and people who go to medical school. And it's like, fuck them. They are doing something that they will pay for. Their jobs will pay for or not. But why anybody should be subsidizing something like that is beyond me. And I think Emma's story is good because it really lays bare both the scope of a lot of that, but also the ways in which it is setting up a future problem by incentivizing people, not people, but subsidizing marginal programs with degrees that are really not worth what they already cost.
All right. Last week wasn't only not great for Democrats, also for the Republicans who allegedly run the House of Representatives. First, after 4 months of torturous bipartisan negotiations, Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma unveiled the border security bill that Republicans had insisted be a condition of any further aid money to Ukraine and Israel, only to see said bill declared dead on arrival by Donald Trump and various House Republicans and various senators as well. Then, in a surprise to them, House Republicans failed to secure enough votes to impeach Department of Homeland Security Chief Alejandro Mayorkas over his handling of the border. So where things roughly stand now is that the Senate actually looks poised to push through about a $95 million funding bill for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. They'll vote on probably later this week, and maybe the House will vote again. Who knows if they have enough votes to impeach Mayorkas. And the asylum policy bits are tabled for the moment because many Republicans are saying openly that they need to have a presidential election first. That's how much the crisis at the border matters. Nick, what does this all say about Republican stewardship of the legislative branch?
I want to bring it back to cognitive decline first, because when I was reading the notes you sent around, Matt, I thought the Republicans were going to impeach Andy Milonakis, the web presence and comedian. And I was like, wow, that's, I don't know the details, but I want to see that trial.
Yeah.
It shows that the Republican Party is plainly not serious about legislation or policy, I think. And it's disturbing to me. It was kind of a political masterstroke by Biden, and I guess we shouldn't use the word stroke with anything related to him anymore out of deference. But to link Ukraine aid and Israel aid in a speech that he gave late last year, which I thought was pretty good. But tying border stuff to foreign aid is kind of okay. You see the politics of that. What I would love to see is Republicans in the Senate who, in many ways, I agree with their balking on foreign policy. This new bill would send $60 billion to Ukraine. We've already spent something like $92 billion to Ukraine in humanitarian and military aid over the past decade. Most of that is since the Russian invasion of Ukraine proper in 2022. But let's have a debate about foreign policy. Justin Amash, the former congressman who's thinking about a run for Senate from Michigan, tweeted out that all of this foreign policy stuff, like we should have declarations of war, authorizations of war. If you're spending, if you're talking about spending $60 billion to Ukraine, which is a country that we have no actual defense agreements with. We don't have anything in writing saying we have to defend it. Let's put all of that to a vote and actually, lay the issue out in front of the country as well. I would love to see that. And I would love to see the Republicans really push their border control stuff because, I dislike the Republican antipathy towards legal immigration, and some of the stuff they're talking about the border would actually, Mike Lee, who has emerged as a real mediocre constitutional, integralist or whatever you want to call it. Part of his complaints about what the border control stuff is that it would actually allow in a bunch of H-1B people. It has nothing to do with the border. It's like he's anti-immigration. Let's have that argument. Let's talk about the border. Let's talk about immigration, and let's talk about foreign policy in clean, focused discussion so that we can actually understand where the parties are, where the American people are, and actually get legislation that reflects what we want as a country.
Peter, I have an uncharitable streak inside of me that I try to not let out, but I'm going to test it out with you, which is that the Republicans on the national level, let's say more than on the local level, are really comfortable with being a 49% minority party. It's great to be in opposition, to say no a lot, really loud, to throw a fit. Not so great to be responsible for anything. Can you talk me out of my uncharitable stance?
They're not tired of losing.
Right?
They're just ready to keep losing. They love it. I think there's some truth to that. But what I would say is it's not so much that they love losing, that their goal is to lose. Instead, it's that they are comfortable in that position because they know how to operate in that environment where they can just reflexively say no to things. In addition, they don't know what to do without Donald Trump being there to tell them what to do. And we have talked about this on this podcast repeatedly. Go back to 2020 when the Republican Party did not release a new platform. Go look at what the president of the Heritage Foundation is tweeting in the past month, where he's saying, you know what, the party is just whatever Donald Trump does now. That is not just the position of the president of the Heritage Foundation. That is also the position of many elected officials in Congress who are Republicans. They don't have ideas for what America should be, for what the Republican Party should be, for what sort of legislation should be passed or what sort of policies should be put in place. The idea they have is we do Trump stuff. And that's really hard to do when Trump is not in office. Even when he's in office, it's frankly hard to do because, like I said earlier, he's kind of deranged and a maniac and not somebody that you can reliably take clear policy positions from. But that is what the party wants to do. They want to say no, and they want to keep saying no, and they want to make life difficult for Democrats and Joe Biden because that is a comfort zone that they exist in. And then they want to say yes to whatever brain farts Trump comes up with, in his speeches, in which he is A/B testing ideas kind of at random and figuring out what he thinks by whatever gets the most applause.
Emma, you're sitting in the Catherine Mangu Award Memorial podcast chair today. So with that kind of Republican dysfunction in mind, but also channeling Catherine, how exciting was it for you last week that Nikki Haley in Nevada lost to none of the above?
Oh, it was so exciting. I think I, like Catherine, was cautiously optimistic about Haley in the very beginning. And then the rest of this election season has sort of been like when you're in the late stages of a relationship and you keep trying to convince yourself that maybe it's going to be okay because the first 6 months were bliss. There is this, she's worked very hard to destroy everything I liked about her. And so unfortunately, while I'm pretty sure her losing to none of the above was not so much a general dissatisfaction with politics, but a dissatisfaction with the fact that Trump wasn't on the ballot, either way, it makes me excited to see politicians lose.
Yes, that is the most fun to have at the ballot box, is to vote people out. And I wish every state, county, city had that opportunity. All right, we're going to get to our listener email of the week here in a moment. But first, a reminder that this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Friends, the best relationships in your life aren't always the easiest. For instance, you could have a daughter who became a teenager during the COVID pandemic in a heavily blue state controlled by teachers' unions. Was I talking out loud? Sometimes in such trying cases, you got to put in some dedicated work to come out of the other side of the bad times. Therapy can be a vital tool to get that serious work done. That's where BetterHelp Online Therapy comes in. BetterHelp is an easy-to-use, super flexible, entirely online therapy service that's helped many listeners of this here podcast better use their own internal operating system so that the challenges can be met. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire, get matched with a therapist. If you don't like the first one, just swap them out for a second. Let therapy be your emotional Home Depot gift certificate. Don't know what that means, but you know what I mean. With BetterHelp, just visit betterhelp.com/roundtable right now to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/roundtable. Do it today. You'll be glad you did. Okay, reminder, please email your short queries to roundtable@reason.com. This one comes from Matthew Runkle. Great name. He writes, off and on for months now, I've been hearing about the apparent regrets of Oregonians regarding their decision to decriminalize all drugs, with even Democrat leaders, I see what you did, Matthew, discussing some measure of reversal, even though Reason wouldn't necessarily celebrate drug decriminalization. Does that mean you inevitably view Oregon as a success, Nick Gillespie?
No, I don't. But I also, the reports of it being a complete disaster are overblown. There's a very good piece by Maya Solovitz in the New York Times a week or so ago. When you actually break down the stats of who is overdosing in Oregon, how long they've lived there, et cetera, it undercuts the narrative, among other things, that, drug addicts are moving to Oregon in order to overdose on fentanyl, and things like that. It's just not true. The other big thing to consider about that is that, as Solovitz makes clear, fentanyl hit different parts of the country at different waves. And there are, when you have something like that, almost all strictures on, dealing with something in a positive way from a policy position kind of fall to the wayside. So that explains part of certain types of spikes in overdoses in Oregon. I think what is true, and this it does worry me, because when drug policy is not implemented well, such as the legal marijuana rollouts in California and New York State, especially New York City, it really casts it makes it harder to actually argue for the benefits of an open and regulated market in new vices. And Oregon, among other things, did not spend any of the money that they were supposed to be spending on things like treatment and education. That is now starting to hit things. But so they kind of did things ass backwards in certain ways. But I worry about bad implementation of drug legalization policies, but it does not in any way, shape, or form shake my confidence that when we have a legal market for things, we will actually see fewer social ills, for the same reason that, prohibition, Peter talked about prohibition on this show last week, I believe, for exactly the same reasons that alcohol prohibition. We need to get to a point where people know what they're taking, how to take what they're taking, and then create all of the moderating institutions, including some legal changes, in order to deal with the fact that we're going to have a broader range of intoxicants and performance enhancers and things that make us feel the way we want to feel available to everybody.
Peter, I wonder if there's if we could have read a similar email in 1933. When in some of the ways that states kind of after Prohibition created new alcohol regulation regimes and whatnot.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think by the time Prohibition was over, there was a pretty broad consensus that it was a good idea to end Prohibition. And then the policy, this is a thing that people forget, is that Prohibition was ended federally, but then it's only sort of ended everywhere at the same time, because then it was left up to the states, and alcohol policy was set by the states, and many states remained in a sort of a zone of quasi-prohibition for years after Prohibition was officially lifted at the federal level. I think the way that I think about the Oregon question is twofold. One is a lot of what people are reacting to is COVID or COVID-adjacent chaos. And it is, I think, a frankly unfortunate fact that a bunch of drug legalization happened around the same time as America and the rest of the world, frankly, went into a weird kind of lonely meltdown for a year or two during COVID. And you just see all sorts of crazy effects from the pandemic where people stayed inside, didn't go out, didn't talk to each other. And there was just a kind of mania in the world, in the populace that happened. And you see it's a kind of cabin fever that overtook the country and overtook a lot of people. And in particular, it was visible and felt in cities. And so people feel like cities are more chaotic and they feel like those cities just have real problems now, and they are associating them with drug legalization. And I don't think most of the problems stem directly from drug legalization. The other thing I would say is that if you think the Oregon experiment failed, then it is incumbent upon you to say how recriminalization, how going back to putting users in jail for using drugs is going to fix this problem. Because it's not obvious that criminalization and a regime in which drugs are criminalized and we put people in jail and we arrest them just for using drugs, it's not obvious that stops overdoses, that stops abuse, that makes streets safer or people better off. Address the problem. If the problem is addiction, if the problem is fentanyl, if the problem is that people are taking way too much of this stuff or using it badly, then address that problem. Don't treat this as a criminal issue where the only solution is let's have the police, the guys with the guns, pick these people up and put them in jail.
Emma, how do you view Oregon decriminalization thus far?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with Nick and Peter. I think a lot of this is the results of prohibition, right? Like most people who OD on fentanyl did not intend to use fentanyl. They intended to use another drug. And part of drug users getting these really low quality black market drugs is because they have to go to the black market. And if, creating and selling drugs was legalized, there would be clear incentives for people to make drugs and say, look, I can prove that this is pure, that this is, a set amount of the drug you want to consume so you're not going to overdose. And I also think that a lot of what people are viscerally responding to is not so much drug crisis, but homelessness. Right. And the fact that there are a lot of drug users who are on the streets and who are acting in various antisocial ways, maybe even being violent. And, that's not to say that people overdosing in their homes is great. Obviously, every overdose death is a tragedy. But, I also don't think it's irrational for people to not love it when there is a huge increase in their city's homeless population. Right. And so, if we made it, this all goes back to housing, right? Like if we made it easier for developers to build housing, if we had an abundance of cheap housing, then, maybe not so many people would end up in this spiral that leads to them living on the streets and doing drugs.
And people say that's a ridiculous comparison sometimes. I think when you say, oh, you can solve these, homelessness problems with cheaper housing. But in fact, if you look at the correlation between states with the cheapest housing and states with the most expensive housing, the states with it's like a nearly perfect line where the states with the cheapest housing have by far the smallest homelessness problems, and the places with the most expensive housing have by far the largest homelessness problems.
I think you also have to look at the rural versus urban split on that. I generally agree with you. One of the things to think about, Matt, you mentioned 1933. If, let's say, you get rid of all currently, illegal or illicit drugs, as the government tends to call them, you would still have alcohol, and that
Thank
is, God. Yeah. But when you're talking about homelessness and stuff like that, most people who are homeless are not necessarily using their drug of choice. They're using a drug that is available, and if they don't have, heroin, they're gonna drink more, et cetera. So that the problem of homelessness and drug problems, substance abuse problems, intersect, but you need to clarify what you're solving. The other thing, over the weekend, I saw a number of people talking about safe consumption sites for drugs, and mostly they were posting images of high-end bars. One of the problems that has happened, and this is true in a variety of mostly West Coast cities, partly because they're more liberal, in some place like Portland. Portland, Oregon is a chaos center, for many years now. It's not because of illegal drugs or drugs becoming decriminalized. It goes a lot deeper than that. But there has been an equation of saying a safe consumption site is to allow people to do drugs anywhere they want. And you hear that a lot in critiques of San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. There should be alternatives to that so that there is a sense of public, kind of common space. That is somewhat ordered. And that can be achieved too. But again, a lot of these things are conflated or intertwined that need to be separated out.
All right. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office, which, despite media inattention, still exists, released its latest long-term fiscal outlook. And there is a person on this podcast who reads CBO reports for breakfast before going jogging with John Belushi, and that is Peter Suderman. So, Peter, why don't you take a quick lead on explaining what was in there? What's the macro picture of the long-term fiscal outlook for this country of ours?
The numbers are big, and they are bad, and they are bigger and getting badder over the next 10 years. That's the main summary here. So look, the deficit over the next 10 years is now projected to grow from 1.6 trillion to 2.6 trillion. So we're going to have $2.5 trillion deficits. That is, to be clear, the deficit is not the debt. The deficit is just the 1-year gap. And so we are going to enter into a world of fiscal gaps of $2.5 trillion a year within the decade. And a big part of that is that we have run up so much debt that we are now paying gigantic interest payments. And so this stuff is now building on itself and feeding on itself, where 3/4 of the additional deficit increase over the next decade is projected to come just from rising interest payments. And so we are paying to carry all of this money and paying extra to carry all of this debt. And you go back a couple of years to the early 2022 when Biden was bragging about bringing down the deficit. And just look at it now. This is a bad situation. No one in either party is doing anything about this, but it's really remarkable to see that Biden was saying, "Oh, look, I love it when Republicans talk about the deficit because I've brought it down." I mean, the way that he argued that the justification for saying I brought it down back then was BS, because what Biden was doing was just pointing to planned expiration of COVID era programs, right? That would be like if I bought a very expensive bottle of whiskey this year and then didn't buy it next year, and I said, "Look at all the money I saved by not buying the very expensive bottle of whiskey again." Just ridiculous. And now you see that we are entering into really uncharted fiscal territory here, where deficits are running way above what they have historically, even adjusting for the larger economy and the larger federal budget. It's unsustainable. No one wants to do anything about it. And CBO just keeps issuing these warnings. And at this point, it's really it is irresponsible that no one in Washington seems to be listening.
Nick, what is a number or a thing that jumped out at you from this release?
I don't have the number in front of me, but one of the things that jumped out from that CBO report was that immigrants helped reduce the amount of deficit spending. They helped increase revenue and things like that. And, this points to a larger, question. The policy towards immigration, and all we do now is talk about the border with Mexico. That is not even the main source of undocumented or illegal immigrants coming into the country, but it tells us nothing about what kind of immigration policy we should want. We have an economy that is, chugging along, could be supercharged by, having more workers available and things like that. And, the CBO report helps point out that immigration is one of the things that helps us. Emma was talking about, the dream of, people having above replacement birth rates and things like that. Immigrants solve that every time they cross the border. Even if they too, once they're here, they tend to have fewer and fewer kids the longer they're here. Wealth does that. There's nothing wrong with not having kids or having fewer kids than, 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. But that's what the CBO report was also kind of sending a kind of ethos pitch there, Matt, was that immigration is good for the economy.
The Rip Sewell of the federal government. Emma, what jumped out at you from this?
Yeah, I think what really struck me was yet again being reminded just how expensive Social Security is, and how we're all doomed because this is so expensive, and oh my God, we need to means test it. And I was thinking of something that Eric Boehm here at Reason likes to bring up, which is that the people who are receiving Social Security checks are richer as a group than the younger people who are being taxed to pay for them. This is an anti-equality program. Like if you dream of a world in which, people are more equal due to wealth transfers, like this is not the policy for you. I don't think that the elderly and other people who are unable to work should have to live in grinding poverty in this country. But I think we can accomplish some kind of minimal safety net to prevent that without giving, 70-year-old millionaires Social Security checks.
I think it'll be a beautiful day when millennials and Gen Z hector their parents and grandparents who are driving them to their jobs, to their part-time jobs, to say, hey, maybe give back some of that Social Security. Let's end this program.
To bring this back to the topic that we started with, one of the things the CBO report emphasizes is that a huge amount of the growth in federal spending is directly a result of the aging of the population and increases in health spending as a result of that.
I recall, thinking back to the beginning of the podcast, talking about Senator James Lankford. I made a bet with him in 2017 or 18 whenever Trump was getting through his tax cut. And back then, there was still the pretense by some Republican members of Congress and the Senate that they would refuse to approve anything that added to the deficit by even one dime, or the long-term debt by even one dime. It's Bob Corker, not even a nickel, he had said. And Lankford stood upon his head until his ears turned red and said that. And I'm like, do you want to bet? You and me, let's have a bet and see whether the deficit will be added to within the next 5 years. Or
have
whatever.
You collected on that bet? Is he dressing up as a French maid and cleaning your apartment on a regular basis now?
I need to see the search terms on Twitter, whether I can unearth this bet, and I'm gonna collect on the ginger, on the Oklahoma ginger, on this. The other thing that comes to mind is
that's actually a pretty good cocktail.
I would try it. Is that Peter has mentioned $2.6 trillion deficits, 1 year deficits. The last budget of Bill Clinton, America's greatest baby.
It's like $1.9 trillion or something.
It was 1.8 trillion dollars. Granted in nominal terms, so it's probably above $3 now.
And also
still.
balanced.
And balanced. That's right. That's when we were talking about
primary
lockboxes.
terms. Yeah,
we were going to lockbox that Social Security.
Whatever happened to that guy who ran against George Bush?
I don't remember.
Yeah,
in fact,
just gone missing.
All right, let's get to our end of podcast, what we have all been consuming in the cultural arena. Peter, why don't you lead us off?
I watched Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the series on Amazon Prime Video. It is a truly fantastic, surprisingly good reimagining of the 2005 spy thriller that featured Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie as married spies who, unbeknownst to either of them, get assigned to assassinate each other. So this is a longer and more, in some ways, more thoughtful story about two private spies who are assigned to live as husband and wife and then go on missions together. It's developed in part by Donald Glover, who did Atlanta and a bunch of other stuff, and is just fantastic. It's sort of weirdly low key and kind of just surprisingly sly and funny in ways that you don't expect, while also having some really great action sequences and some really phenomenal location photography in lower New York. You just actually looks like New York in a way that all of these shows that are shot in front of green screens or on studios don't. And so it's really nice just to see New York portrayed that way on film. But what they've done is this great job of building a spy story that is also a a couple coming together story. And so on their very first mission, the first thing, of course, that they do is they end up at a little kind of a cutesy coffee shop together, and they're talking about their habits and what they like and what they don't, and they're just sort of, and then it proceeds from there. In the middle of the series, they go on a double date and a vacation, and it's like, oh, these are the stages of a relationship. There is even a really fantastic episode. I don't want to spoil too much, but they have to do a kind of it's not quite a rescue mission. It's an escort mission of, I don't know, maybe a big, bad, rich guy played by Ron Perlman, who is just a cranky child. And the whole episode is a metaphor for taking care of a little kid, except that the little kid is super cranky Ron Perlman. It's just great. There's all sorts of guest stars all over who are wonderful. John Turturro is in this as well. Paul Dano plays a sort of interesting supporting character. This is the kind of remake and rethinking that I wish Hollywood would do a lot more of, in taking a good initial concept and instead of just trying to deliver the same thing over again, seeing a totally new way into it. I highly recommend it, even if you're a little bit skeptical. It's Mr. and Mrs. Smith on Amazon.
All right. Nick, what did you consume?
I watched the documentary about the We Are the World song on Netflix. It's called The Greatest Night in Pop, I believe, or something close to that. And it's about the making of We Are the World, which for those of us of a certain age, this was a hinge moment. This is, I think, when the American century ended, more than the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's, Matt, we've talked about this quite a bit, about documentaries that are produced by the people who are the star of the documentary. Yeah. And that brings, certain benefits, because you have certain types of access and, to material that you would not get otherwise, particularly if it was analytic or critical. But then it also brings a lot of negatives. And the big negative is that it begins and ends with Lionel Richie, who is the co-author of the song We Are the World, and who kind of appears now. I have no idea how old he is, but he looks like an Easter Island head. He is so pumped full of fillers and plastic surgery and whatnot. And it's kind of a nostalgia act for, an evening that makes sense. I mean, the list of people who performed on that, is amazing. And it goes in, there's great footage and everything like that. And this was an attempt to take what I guess started with something like the Concert for Bangladesh, the George Harrison, Madison Square Garden offering that brought Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton back to prominence, et cetera, and failed ultimately to deliver that much money to Bangladesh. We Are the World was like that on, cocaine and steroids and human growth hormone and whatnot. It's interesting, particularly because I'm partial to Bob Dylan, to see the kind of subplot of Dylan being almost incapable of performing. And the star of this documentary, more than Michael Jackson or Lionel Richie, is actually Quincy Jones, the conductor of the orchestra, who got everybody to perform, got everybody to settle down. And it's fascinating because Quincy Jones is one of the great figures of post-war America in terms of music. Just vast reach. There's a documentary about him coming out that should be interesting. A guy who was able to fuse all sorts of black and white genres, as well as, going from jazz to hip hop and everything in between, who is mostly remembered now, I think, for a 2018 Vulture interview. Where he talked about how Marlon Brando had fucked Richard Pryor, that he had dated Ivanka Trump when she was like in high school. And then he, his family walked that back for him. But so he's another kind of twilight figure in American culture who, we are at a moment of massive generational shift. And so people like Quincy Jones, people like Lionel Richie or Bob Dylan for that matter, people who really helped define the past, 70 years of American life and meaning, also in politics. That is all changing. And so it's worth checking out what these people were up to and what they accomplished, how they talk about themselves, even if this is not quite as interesting a documentary as it could be if it also had a bit of a critical edge.
Quincy Jones, also the producer and mastermind behind Michael Jackson's Thriller, which is one of the greatest pop albums of all time, just in terms of sonic production. When I want to impress people with speakers and show them what music can sound like, I play them Thriller because everybody knows that album. Yeah. Everybody has heard it so many times that it's just drilled into their heads. And then you hear it on good speakers and you're like, oh my goodness. What, like, this is not just like a sort of cheap radio pop. This has been produced to the nines, and it's just exquisite. And that's all Quincy Jones.
Nick, did the documentary solve the Dan Aykroyd riddle?
It did not. It did not really mention him. One of the things that's fascinating is when you look at the list of people who in 1985 were big enough to be in that room, who you're like, why were they there? And even if you're even if you grew up with them, you're kind of like, okay, I forgot why Jeffrey Osborne was big enough to be there.
Just once, Nick. Just once.
Okay. No. And even some of the soloists, it does go into details of, Prince was supposed to show up, but then chose not to at the last minute, which is why Huey Lewis of Huey Lewis and the News, who looks like he's living on the streets in Portland, Oregon right now, kind of talks about that. He is very good-natured, and he's like a great, rock demigod. He's not really in the full pantheon, but has kept his humor going and things like that. Sheila E., Matt, the magnificent Sheila E., she brings probably the most poignant ambivalence because she realizes she was in the chorus. She knows that she was there because they were hoping to get Prince to show up if she was there, as they were involved at the time musically, if not personally. But
Cyndi Lauper is the vocal hero of that song, and I'm going to stand.
She is in many ways. And then, of course, I tweeted this out over the weekend, and I'll put it in the show notes whether people like it or not. I isolated Springsteen's solo line, which
his throat was giving birth to a pig.
Yeah, it's and Matt, you'll enjoy this. They had interviews with everybody in different locations, and he is somehow in a working man shack.
Spends a long time there.
It's like because he doesn't spend enough time in Rumson, New Jersey, which is where his main residence is, and which is one of the richest towns on the planet. He is in a working man's cabin, and it's worth that.
All right, Emma. Sorry for that. You can wake up now. What did you consume?
So I watched the Miyazaki film Princess Mononoke for the first time. I mean, unless you count, I caught the last 20 minutes of it in my 9th grade English class for some reason. My teacher was playing that.
They only showed the last 20 minutes?
Well, I think I'd been sick. I don't remember why. I think I had been sick. Anyway, this was a long time ago. It doesn't matter. And I didn't remember what happened. And it was great. I really enjoyed it. It's just a visually stunning film with a wonderful score, sort of about industrialization and the destruction of nature. And, honestly, it's a very NIMBY film. It's very anti-industrialization, very anti-human progress. Granted, there are sentient spirits living in the forest. So I guess there's a greater claim that you shouldn't destroy the forest for human flourishing if sentient creatures live, there's a different situation than in the modern world. But I do think what you're supposed to take from it is sort of that human progress vis-a-vis industrialization is bad, which I ultimately disagree with, but I don't care because it was, a riveting story. It was beautiful. It was way more violent than I was expecting it to be. I had just seen The Boy and the Heron, which is also PG-13, and I was sort of expecting it to be a little intense, but I wasn't expecting to see people get beheaded by with demonic arrows and limb removal to be happening. I did not like that personally, but I really enjoyed it. I have HBO Max basically purely to watch Miyazaki movies, so it was high time that I see this one.
So my cultural consumption, I'm beginning to realize in my senescence, Nick Gillespie, that my role to transmit any culture is about whatever happens to pop rock musician who just dies. So Mojo Nixon died last week. He was a cultish 80s character for the most part. rockabilly, psychobilly, yapper.
Shockabilly, yeah.
Shockabilly. It was very important to some of us in the late 1980s. I was a big fan back then. And then he was sort of co-opted by MTV after he had written the classic song, I Want to Be Stuffin' Martha's Muffin. So anyways, in sort of appreciating Mojo, went and listened to my favorite podcast in the world, which is by a good friend of mine, Ken Lane, called the Desert Oracle Podcast, which is usually about the desert and spooky stories and UFOs and weird spirituality and such. Ken knew Mojo in the 80s in San Diego and played in the same kind of country punk scene as the Beat Farmers and some other Buddy Blue and people who came out of that. And it is a very personal. Mojo played in Ken's band, it's a very personal, kind of wide-ranging and idiosyncratic 30 minutes of radio and podcast talking about a strange and wonderful little character who kind of died with his boots on. He was on a celebrity cruise, not a celebrity cruise, but a cruise for outlaw country music. He was a outlaw Sirius XM country type of guy. And it's a great podcast episode, great entree into a very strange character. And you will be rewarded if you go on YouTube and start just like typing in Mojo Nixon and Country Dick Montana from the Beat Farmers, who's everyone's guru back in that scene. And it's definitely worth checking out. And it's just, it harkens back. And Michael Sokolow, and I'm sorry for pronouncing his name badly, wrote, I think, a really good little obit at Reason that just talked about the college rock times in which that nurtured the Mojo Nixons of the world in the late 80s, and how like it was just sort of like a desperate attempt for people in a Michael Jackson dominated mass popular culture to find anything that resonated with them, and to like, how do you find the information about the music, let alone anything else? And it speaks to that. And Mojo is definitely a character of that time, and very moving.
Also, Matt, what I think and it's interesting to think about him in conjunction to something like We Are the World, because there was a whole, you need that mainstream culture, or that mainstream culture is good and important. But you also need the people who kind of elaborate on the edges and pull it into different directions. And one of the things I think about with somebody like Mojo Nixon is that he took advantage of kind of alternative distribution networks, or, where people just had to create the stuff that they wanted, because what was then called mainstream culture was just sealed off for most people. And you had mentioned that he got co-opted by MTV. In a way, what he showed is that, the mainstream was ultimately, and corporate culture was exceptionally open and remains exceptionally open to people who are doing something a little bit different and a little bit weird. There is something that happened in, post-war America for sure, but I think starting in the 80s and then especially in the 90s, just where people really started to say, you know what, I'm going to do my own thing in a profound way. And they were able to bring it to a public, whether it's 1,000 true fans or you become the biggest bands in the world. I mean, when you think about groups like REM and U2 at the beginning of the 80s, were on what were considered small labels and then became the biggest bands in the world. Like, the system was so open. The system is even more fragmented now and gives a lot of people a lot more opportunity to say what they want to say to an audience that finds that interesting.
And it's a new challenge to find new stuff too, in a different way, in a world of plenitude as opposed to a world of scarcity, which is pretty awesome to try to tackle. All right, that's all the tackling we have time for. Blocking and tackling. Season's over. It's now baseball metaphors until we die. Thank you for listening to the Reason Roundtable podcast. Listen to all of our podcasts. We're going to die that soon? Yes. At reason.com/podcast. Big ups to Emma Stone for Emma Camp. Well, Jesus fucking Christ.
Cognitive.
I'm
let's call
flattered.
this episode
I've never done that one before.
Cognitive decline.
Yeah. Listen.
And you have the president of Mexico and Egypt.
Did you like my performance in Poor Things?
That was beautiful. Thank you for everyone.
More of a La La Land fan.
We're going to keep it. We're going to keep it. It's important to tie the room together with evidence of decline. We'll catch everybody next Monday. If you like to witness grown men do terrible things on YouTube, please go to reason.com/donate and encourage us to do more. And a big thank you also to the people who donated to our webathon at the level to have a special Zoomcast with the four of us on podcast, which we've done 3 of those in the past week or so, and they were delightful. Great fun. So hopefully we'll have some opportunity to do that next year when the webathon rolls around. That's it. We'll see you next week. Thanks.